Hello and good morning, friends. Welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, with continuation in our series on women and history, today we would be talking in detail on women's agency. We would be covering the past and the present portion. And for this discussion, we have once again with us in our studios Dr. Shruti Vip. Dr. Shruti Vip is Assistant Professor in Department of History, PGDAV Evening College, University of Delhi. Dr. Vip has immense experience, and we believe that her experience would definitely help us out in understanding the entire series in detail. So, taking the lecture forward, let's welcome Dr. Shruti Vip once again. Hello, ma'am. Welcome to Naidu Led Lecture.
Hello, friends. In today's lecture, we would be discussing the aspect of women's agency. So far, I have spoken about various educational reforms, various activities that were going on, the socio-religious reform movements that had taken off in a big way during 19th century and its impact that continued during the 20th century. But a very important aspect of the overall topic on women in history is women's agency. What do you understand by the term women's agency? The term has deeper connotations and has been discussed at length by a very well-known economics Nobel laureate, Professor Amartya Sen, in his famous work, Development as Freedom. In this work, he has highlighted how it is so much important that in order to exercise development and in order to enjoy the fruits of development, it is so much important for freedom also to be there and freedom to be experienced by all sections of society. And women definitely are a very important part of the society. Almost 50% they constitute the society. So therefore, how they have worked for their own benefit, the various women organizations that have developed over a period of time, and how historically they could be organized, they could be constituted, reconstituted, and what changes came about in this organizational paradigm after independence would be the focus of discussion in today's lecture. But as we have always done in this lecture series, we have to take into consideration the past trends in order to understand the various changes that came about in the present time. So, I would be beginning the discussion from the colonial period itself. So, first of all, we would be discussing various male-inspired and male-guided organizations for women that emerged in colonial India. So, in this, one can briefly mention the important role played by organizations like Brahmo Samaj, Arya Mahila Samaj, Prarthana Samaj. Brahmo Samaj, that was founded by Raja Ram Mohan Roy in 1825, tried to eradicate the prejudices against women, and a very important role in this entire process was played by Keshav Chandra Sen, who was a very important leader of Brahmo Samaj, and he also talked in detail about the importance of education for women. But this movement, though it began in Bengal, gradually spread its influence over other parts of the country also. Then a very important role was also played by Prarthana Samaj, which again falls in the league of those organizations that were initiated by the male reformers. So this movement took off in Bombay, and a very important role was played by M.G. Ranade, R.G. Bhandarkar and N.G. Chandavarkar. Now this organization also began with the aim of social reform, but later on zeroed down on education, and also it organized the first widow remarriage in 1869. Now, a very important role that was played by these organizations was spreading literacy among women, particularly English language and also the vernaculars, which enabled women to learn not only about the alphabets and other basic subjects, but also apprised them of important women's issues and also made them realize that it was possible to get rid of social evils with protracted struggle. Now, in this entire process, most of these organizations, they were led by male guardians, and soon this also resulted in formation of new clubs, associations that were also headed by women. But the process was very slow and steady, and it took off only by the last decade or so of 19th century, and definitely in a big way during 20th century. Ramabai Ranade, who was the wife of Justice M.G. Ranade, not only set up the Arya Mahila Samaj for the upliftment of women, but also insisted on instilling education not only to fulfill duties of a housewife, but also as a more responsible citizen. A very important role in this entire process of emancipation was played by Bharat Mahila Parishad, the National Social Conference that had been started by Indian National Congress in 1887 for a discussion on various social issues that were important for the country's progress. This was soon followed by the foundation of the organization Bharat Mahila Parishad, which aimed to have an all India audience as well as membership. And it formed a very important part of the National Social Congress. Ramabai Ranade, in its very first meeting, encouraged women to work along with men for the revival of nation, and also for it also laid down the cause of finding jobs for women, particularly for young widows, so that they could respectfully sustain themselves. In addition to these organizations, the Muslim community was also realizing the importance of a woman's agency. So therefore, we come across a number of developments among Muslim community also, and to promote education among Muslim girls, Anjumane Khawatine Islam was formed in Punjab in 1916. And great initiatives in this regard were undertaken by Begum of Bhopal, who formed an all India Muslim Women's Conference that questioned the practice of polygamy as well as parda. But the problem was that the orthodox elements of the community criticized the active role that was being played by these organizations, and there were a series of checks and balances in this entire process of formation of agency among Muslim women. A very important role was played by Bharat Mahila Parishad in addition to these Muslim women organizations in instilling confidence and hope among women during 19th and 20th centuries. However, most of these organizations that had begun with the help and leadership of men and with some guidance and support of some educated women had various limitations that also cannot be overlooked. For example, there was a limited perspective of changing the position of women within the family. So there was an overall emphasis on instilling domesticity, in instilling discipline, value-added education, value-based education, morality, chastity, etc. And very less was spoken about independence, financial independence of women, and women being able to fight for their just causes. So everything was kind of developing very slowly, but definitely gradually, and some beginnings had been made through these organizations. Then another problem was the gender bias of the reform movement, which was implicit in the notion that education, any kind of education, whether it was Western or Indian, would instill greater discipline, hygiene, morality among women. So this insistence on particular qualities that had to be bred among women again resulted in creation of gender binaries and strengthening of masculinity in Indian society. Now, having discussed these initial organizations and the role played by them, our next aspect which we would be discussing is the women's organizations that were founded by women themselves. Many organizations began by late 19th and early 20th century. For example, a very important role in this trend was played by Sarla Devi, who was the niece of Rabindranath Tagore. She very actively worked for her mother's organization known as Sakhi Samiti that had been founded in 1910, and she also formed Bharat Stri Mahamandal. In 1917, a very important delegation was led by Sarojini Naidu to demand a series of reforms for improving the condition of women. And this definitely had an impact not only on the leaders of Indian National Congress, but also on the colonial masters. Sarla Devi made a series of representations before the committee on behalf of Bharat Stri Mahamandal, and she was carrying forward the legacy not only for Bengali women but for women of entire India. The Naidu Led Delegation, which was organized by the Irish suffragette leader M.F. Cousins, it consisted of as many as 14 women, and they demanded better educational facilities as well as political rights equal to men, which was definitely a great achievement as far as those times were concerned. Sarla Devi not only demanded educational institutions for widows, but also enactment of laws for eradicating early marriage, child marriage, infanticide, and also to facilitate inheritance rights of Hindu widows, which were seriously lacking. She also demanded that the daughters should be facilitated not only for education but also for educational opportunities abroad as well as for work opportunities and particularly professional training. Basic issues that were raised by women were not only facilitation of female education but also eradication of evil practices that were hindering their movement, for example, parda, etc., and also low status of women in the family. So this low status was now being increasingly questioned by these educated middle class women. The class bias of movements, however, continued to exist. So even these women-led movements, the women-led agency, also suffered from caste and class bias, as very few pro-poor legislations or initiatives were talked about. Now, coming to the next important aspect of the lecture, and that is a discussion on national women's organizations. So here we would be discussing that how by turn of the century, by 20th century, with the spread of education, with the spread of awareness, and with an important role being played by educated women, there was an increasing talk and discussion on all India level organizations. While the earlier women's organizations were urban and sectarian, local and regional, geared to social reforms, the new age organizations were more holistic in their approach, and a series of organizations emerged from 1917 to 1927. The three major women's organizations that appeared on Indian scene during this period were Women's Indian Association, second was the National Council of Women in India, and the third was All India Women's Conference. Women's India Association, that was formed in 1917. This was the first ever attempt to organize women on an all India level basis, and organization was open to both the Indians as well as the Europeans. So it was definitely a step ahead as far as women agency was concerned. So there was a big jump from the local to the national and also international, since this organization was open even to European women. The founding members of this organization were Annie Besant, Margaret Cousins, Dorothy Jeeves Raja. Most of them were theosophists, and they were very much focused towards women's rights, particularly the suffragette movement and the national freedom. The aims and objectives of this organization were not only to secure education but also to end various social evils prevalent, as well as to promote right to work among women. And to secure all these rights, they initiated their struggle both at the level of municipal, legislative councils, talukas, and so it also had important political connotations. It also demanded equality of rights and opportunities between men and women. Again, this was going to be a benchmark demand for women, particularly during the beginning of 20th century. Then another very important emphasis that emerged out of this organization was not only development of self but also development of community and service of others. So the entire process was going to drive women out of their homes, mobilize them so that they become socially responsible citizens. Discussing the next important women all India level organization, that is the NCWI, which was formed in 1925. It came to be accepted as a national branch of International Council of Women. So it continued to play a very important role in times to come. It basically focused on removal of disabilities of women, whether they were legal disabilities or economic or social or political and even cultural. But the problem again with this organization was that it was largely elitist in nature. A series of discussions that were undertaken by NCWI, for which it is very famous, were a discussion on Hindu widows' right to property bill, then bill to validate marriages between different castes and communities, then bill to amend the Child Marriage Restraint Act, birth control, and the questionnaire from the League of Nations, as well as legal, political and economic status of women, which was always on their demand. So NCWI not only facilitated a legitimization of these demands by putting them on an all India basis, but also it insisted that women's role lay beyond mere housekeeping and raising children. It was also geared towards their self-growth, their upliftment as well as nation building. The emphasis, however, rested on the child welfare measures and also family benefit and the maternity and child welfare societies that were discussed in detail by these organizations started seeing light of the day by the third decade of 20th century. Now coming to the next important organization, that is All India Women's Conference, that emerged from 1925 to 1926, a very important role in this organization was played by Margaret Cousins, who was the founder secretary of the Women's India Association. She mobilized several women's organizations to discuss the most crucial challenge that was still there, and that was the issue of women's education. A women's conference on educational reforms was organized in each province to facilitate local solutions. So now these organizations were also realizing that how it was important to discuss local problems, and all India level solutions need not apply to local problems, need not be a solution to local problems. So therefore, this realization made them realize the importance of micromanagement and micro studies that were undertaken by the organization to facilitate maximum benefit for maximum women. The meetings that were conducted from time to time discussed secondary schools courses in domestic science, journalism, social science, architecture, etc. So some of these were offbeat subjects, and it was now going to be interesting for women to think beyond domesticity. Women students were also to be given scholarships to encourage them to study different laws, to study different subjects like laws, medicine, social science and architecture, which were not traditional subjects for which women used to come out of their homes easily. A very important role was played by the second conference that was organized by AIWC, and that was the campaign for the Sarda Bill against child marriages. The fourth conference that was held under its aegis, it discussed in detail the financial problems of women and zeroed down on the women's inheritance laws that sadly kept women away from paternal property, and it also demanded a memorandum regarding women's franchise. The fifth and the sixth conferences of this organization were also very important, as they discussed the issue of women's labor as well as passed the Maternity Benefits Act. This act was passed as a result of a long drawn out struggle that had been started by this organization. As a result, by 1940, the All India Women's Conference became the main nodal organization which represented women and also worked towards publicizing and politicizing the issues of women, as well as conducted research to provide a solid database for upliftment of women. Now, this database could be used as a yardstick to measure various rights and privileges that needed to be accorded, and how there was a need for a more active policy formation at both the national as well as the state level. The All India Women's Conference, with headquarters in Delhi, works even today for the cause of women. Now, having discussed the colonial period, our next important point of discussion would be as to what happened after independence and how the issue of women's agency progressed further. After India won freedom, what were the changes that came about in various women's organizations? Now, in the first few decades of the post-independence period, the major concern for the nation building exercise was an overall economic growth and political stability. This was again followed by a decade of increased concern and focus on various poverty alleviation programs, and there was a lot of stress on eradicating illiteracy, eradicating poverty and bringing about equity. As a result, gender issues were put on a sideline, and it was subsumed, it was imagined that once poverty and illiteracy would be eradicated from Indian society, then gender equality would automatically be established. Therefore, no specific programs were thought about for almost a decade after independence. In fact, more than a decade after independence, there was more or less a status quo. But a major change came about in this from 1975 onwards. 1975 to 1985 was celebrated as International Women's Decade, and it saw the emergence of autonomous women's movements not only in India but also in various other countries. These movements, though they began as anti-price movements, movements against law, famine relief movements, but soon they also picked up the issue of oppression against women, and particularly 1975 was a very important year for Indian history also, as far as the history of women movements in India is concerned. The reason was the publishing of a very crucial report known as Towards Equality report that came out in 1975. Towards Equality, as the report itself signifies, it shattered the myth of a woman equality having arrived in India. So it was quite paradoxical that though a report was titled Towards Equality, its findings were completely different, completely opposite. It found out during its deliberations and during the course of data collection that India was far away from the reality of gender equality, and it exposed an inferior status of women in the political, economic and social spheres. Now, this was a very tragic finding which was difficult for most of the organizations that were working in the area and even for the government of India. It also described that how nothing had been done to enable women to fulfill their multiple roles. So while the multiple roles of domesticity and outside work, jobs, etc. had been entrusted to women, their lives had become more difficult, more challenging, and nothing had been done to facilitate that these dual roles could be fulfilled by these women easily, conveniently, without hampering their health. The continuing incidents of practices like dowry, child infanticide, etc. were further eye-openers in this regard. Now, in the next course of discussion, I would be discussing what was the impact of this report called Towards Equality. Thank you. The result of the publication of the report Towards Equality in 1975 was that the government realized the need for devising ways, means and strategies to specially uplift women in the field of education, in the field of family planning, health, nutrition, as well as employment, social welfare and enhancing their legal status. As a result, a separate chapter on women and development 1980 to 1985 appeared in the 6th 5-year plan. So, till now, till the 6th 5-year plan, nothing had been done specifically or specially for women in terms of writing a special chapter on the problem. But since 1975 laid bare the necessity of specially the task of dealing with the challenges of low literacy levels among women and also exploitation of women that was still continuing after 3-4 decades of independence, it was realized that only by considering as a special drive something could be achieved. Therefore, now women came to be perceived as important productive contributors to national economy who had to be dealt with separately. The 7th 5-year plan had a chapter on socio-economic programs for women, which was there from 1985 to 1989, and it moved away from the welfare approach to the positive development approach, that is WAD. Now, this transition from WID to WAD is also a very important phase of development for women's agency. There was a realization that only by incorporating women in various development schemes, nothing would be achieved. What was more important was to empower women, to make them play a more active, a more positive role in the entire development process. So, this transition from WID to WAD is very crucial, and this took place in the decades of 1980s when women were not only added as salt, as you add salt to a dish just to enhance the flavor, but specifically to enhance the productive capacity of women. Various special schemes and programs were initiated from time to time, and the aim of these programs was to make women the change makers themselves. A very important observation has been made by Rekha Pandey in this regard, who said that the Indian Parliament adopted a national policy on education in 1986, which included a chapter on education for women's equality. So, it was to that extent that the progress of this issue happened in the course of 1980s. A national perspective for women was also released in October 1988, while the 2000 SARC decade plan of action specifically focused on the problems of the girl child. It was realized that it was futile to talk about women if girls were not being given their due rights, and this realization made government devise a number of strategies, policies, initiatives at the level of primary schooling. Various organizations that emerged after independence also continued to play a very important role in strengthening the women's agencies. Feminine solidarity and power was brought about through various organizations, for example, Manushi, Stri Shakti, Saheli, Nari Samta Manch, Mahila Dakshita Samiti, etc. And a series of socialist women's groups were formed in Bombay, Purogami Sangathan in Pune, SEED, that is Society for Empowerment Through Environment Development, that developed not only in Pune, Hyderabad, but also in various other parts of the country. Now, these various women organizations issued pamphlets, they collected signatures, went in for signature campaigns, organized protest rallies, held nukkad nataks, demonstrations, skits, etc. to bring about an awareness about various women's issues that were plaguing country so many decades after independence also. As a result, soon an autonomous women's organization emerged which was independently dealing with women without any interference from any other section of society. As a result, 1970s that can be described as the decade of autonomous women's organizations, that is those organizations that were not affiliated to any particular political party or to trade unions, developed. They rejected not only the welfarist approach that had been adopted earlier by various women's organizations that were active from pre-independence times onwards, but they also adopted the politics of activity, the protest politics for mobilizing women on specific issues, and they were not shying away even from holding rallies and protest movements, not silently but far more vocally and at times even violently. The autonomous women's organizations mobilized women for collective action, and this was their USP. So therefore, various issues that were plaguing Indian society could not be dealt with single-handedly. For example, for oppressions like dowry, violence within the family, alcoholism among men and wife beating, as well as discrimination at the workplace, only a collective public action could have brought about the desired results. From 1973 to 1974, a very important role in mobilizing women was played by the anti-inflation movement, as it also strengthened the united front of movement belonging to different women belonging to different political parties as well as belonging to different states came together on the issue of price rise, as it was directly or indirectly impacting their daily lives. All India anti-dowry and anti-rape movements were launched by a number of women's organizations, and civil liberties as well as democratic rights organizations also joined them. So therefore, there was definitely a maturity that was being displayed at the level of women's agency in the decade of 1970s and 1980s. These new organizations questioned the welfare approach to women, whereby the government merely saw the new schemes as sops to win over the support of women. Instead, they demanded a more participatory approach that would also empower women. The new organizations that emerged in 1980s and 1990s took the stand of self-employment, and a number of women's associations that encouraged self-employment among women appeared. For example, Seva. A very important development took place in this regard in states like Gujarat, where there was development of a working women's forum, Tamil Nadu, where there was Shramik Mahila Sangathan. In Maharashtra, a series of organizations started working on the issue of women workers in the unorganized sectors, because a large number of women were there in the unorganized sectors, and due to lack of laws in this sector, their exploitation was at its peak. So this was something that urgently had to be looked into. By 1984, the Organization for Women's Liberation, OWL, appeared to fulfill the needs of women in the Nilgiris district. Necessary skills for employment were talked about, and also there was an emphasis on support services, opening of various small-scale industries to generate employment among women. And also there was a discussion on crutch facilities so as to facilitate child rearing and bearing activities of women. By 1992, there was an advancement of rural people and nature in Gujarat, which played a very important role in providing access to poor and needy women to various facilities and employment opportunities. Also in Tamil Nadu, by 1998, there was establishment of Rural Educational Awareness Development Society and Dalit Women Forum that was established in 1993. In addition to these various organizations, one must discuss the important role played by the various funding agencies in bringing about an awareness among various organizations about the financial implications and also how to fulfill their agenda of growth and development. So, a very important role in this regard is being played by the Ministry of Home Affairs, which works actively for preventing and combating drug trafficking, human trafficking, and also carrying out population census decennially as well as for women's development. Then Rashtriya Mahila Kosh, that was specifically set up in 1993, is a national level organization which was started under the Ministry of Women and Child Welfare. It not only promotes a number of NGOs by providing them loans, but also promotes thrift and credit among these various organizations. At the international level, one needs to mention the organizations like UNDP. The objective of UNDP was inclusive growth to help India achieve Millennium Development Goals. Now, these Millennium Development Goals had been devised on an international scale in order to facilitate the governments of various developing and underdeveloped countries to bring about greater equity and rights among the underprivileged. The focus was on the 7 priority states that had been outlined by UNDAF, which are home to the poorest of the poor in India. For example, Assam, Bihar, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Odisha, Rajasthan, and Uttar Pradesh. A very important agency was UN Women. UN Women, which was quite active from 2010 to 2011, it has spoken about the issues of gender equality and empowerment of women, and it is not only working for the empowerment but also for financial stability among women. The important role that was played was a series of employment and empowerment initiatives that were started. For example, DAW, Division for the Advancement of Women, INSTRAW, that is International Research and Training Institute for the Advancement of Women, and also UNIFEM, that is United Nations Development Fund for Women. UN Women specifically addresses the difficulties in the employment of women, the various barriers that exist, the glass ceiling that still exists in various professions, and the need to facilitate an easier working condition for women. Then, in addition to this, coming to the national strategies, a very important role was played by the panchayats as well as by the parliament. And how this was achieved was through reservation. Reservation for women in panchayats, the 73rd and the 74th amendment, the constitutional amendments that were brought about in 1993. They provided for reservation of seats for women in panchayats and municipalities, thereby politically empowering women. With 33% reservation for women in rural and urban local bodies by 2008, 1.2 million elected women representatives were there in the institutions of local governance in rural India, and later on this was extended to 50% reservation in many cases. However, a number of obstacles have been there in the passage of similar reservation bill in the Lok Sabha, and the struggle is still on. Therefore, there has definitely been a journey from development to empowerment, and the NCW that actively pursued the case from 1992 onwards, as well as the Women Development Corporation that was set up in various Indian states, have taken up the cause of empowerment. A very important milestone in this regard was in 1995, the Beijing Declaration, when India ratified the Beijing Declaration. There was a major shift when India undertook this stand, and from the 9th five-year plan onwards, that is from 1997 to 2002, there has been a steady shift from development to empowerment. As a result, not less than 30% of the funds were earmarked for various women-oriented development activities in all the ministries. This was a major change as far as problems related to women were concerned, because now financially there was a well drawn out strategy that should have gone a long way in helping women achieve what they dreamt. By 10th five-year plan from 2003 to 2007, there was a definite shift in bringing about a major change in the science and technology policy, and a number of schemes of scholarships were started for women scientists in order to ensure their greater participation in these disciplines, that is, disciplines related to engineering, medicine, science, IT, etc. And by 30th January 2006, the Department of Women and Child Development, Government of India, began as a separate ministry for gender equitable and child-centered legislation, as well as to devise various policies and programs. Now, having discussed these various national initiatives, it is also important to understand what were the various Millennium Development Goals, because these Millennium Development Goals have been adopted by Indian state also in order to devise its strategies, policies and programs. And most of these MDGs have been devised with the aim of bringing about a more just and equitable society. The Millennium Summit that was held in September 2000 was the largest gathering of the world's leaders in history, and they all adopted UN Millennium Declaration to reduce extreme poverty, illiteracy, and they also devised time-bound programs. And the deadline was 2015, that has sadly been missed, and all these deadlines, they had expected that Millennium Development Goals would be met by 2015. Anyways, many countries are still working on achieving these Millennium Development Goals. They were designed to end exclusion and to promote gender equality. The Millennium Summit decided that the Millennium Development Goal 1 was to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, which plagued most countries of the developing and the underdeveloped world. So, for example, women's income rises quite slowly as compared to men, and in India, while men's average earned income increased by 26% from 2003 to 2005, for women this figure was merely 3%. So, you can see the discrepancy between men and women's work and the returns they bring. Also, various studies have shown that the incidence of hunger and malnutrition is far more among women and children than among men. Also, women's access to land is a key obstacle to achieving Millennium Development Goal 1. So, while women produced 80% of food in developing countries, the female-headed households experienced chronic hunger. So, with such paradoxical findings, the Millennium Development Goal has still not been achieved, not at least in our country. Coming to Millennium Development Goal 2nd, that was to achieve universal primary education. The main reason why this still has not been achieved was the violence against girls in school, poor performance, high dropout rates, teenage pregnancy and early marriage. All these problems still persist. Millennium Development Goal 3rd talked about promoting gender equality and empowering women. However, again, the observation has been that women are excluded from power and they make merely 17% of parliamentarians worldwide. This also includes the developed countries' data. Millennium Development Goal 4th talked about reducing child mortality. But research shows that girls in India are 5 times less likely to be fully immunized and to have a nutritious diet as compared to boys. And a very distorted sex ratio exists in the Indian subcontinent, and the ratio has fallen as low as 770 women per 1,000 men in various parts of the state. And the worst performance has been in states like Punjab and Haryana, which are quite progressive and upwardly otherwise. They are one of the richest states in India, but when it comes to sex ratio, their performance is dismal, and Delhi is also closely falling on the heels. Coming to Millennium Development Goal 5th, that was to improve maternal health. However, 1/3 of all births in the poorest countries involve skilled health personnel. So, more than 500,000 women die every year, and the lack of access to skilled birth attendants is one of the most important factor that is resulting in mothers dying while delivering. Millennium Development Goal 7 talked about ensuring environmental sustainability. Here also the sad observation was that whenever there is an adverse change in the environment, for example scarcity in water sources, it directly or indirectly impacts the females in the household, because it is women whose job is to carry potable water. So therefore, women and girls who are responsible for carrying water over long distances are not only suffering from various health issues while carrying out this difficult task, but are also wasting so much of their useful time which they could have used in earning a decent livelihood for themselves. So climate change adverse impact on women definitely needs to be reversed, and also there is a need to ensure environmental sustainability. Now, in this background, it is important to discuss what gender-specific interventions need to be undertaken in order to deal with the problem. Here, one must talk about the Department of Women and Child Development, which had initiated a number of programs related to Balika Samriddhi Yojana, gender-specific interventions, adolescent girls scheme, Kishori Shakti Yojana, and integrated child development services program. In addition to this department, there is Department of Education, which has devised a number of programs related to district primary education, Mahila Samakhya. Then the Department of Health and Family Welfare, which has worked extensively in the field of reproductive and child health program. The Department of Women and Child Development, that was developed in 1987, it launched a support to train employment program, STEP, for women, and this is being implemented through various NGOs as well as agencies. In addition to this, another very important program is DWCD, which implements Swavalamban. This was devised to train young girls in unconventional activities like computers, medical transcription, electronics, etc. In addition to this, a number of ashram schools, particularly in rural and tribal areas, have been started where various crafts and vocations are being integrated with the overall curriculum in order to bring about a more holistic change. Then another important development has been the literacy program Mahila Samakhya of the Education Department. However, all these various programs and activities which have become a very important part of the women agency still need to realize that the findings of Towards Equality 1975 report are still valid, and the reality has changed very little, and a lot still needs to be achieved. There is very little that is value that is attached to housework, whereas majority of Indian women are still involved in housework. So housework, child rearing and bearing activities must be taken into account while calculating the GDP, GNP, and they must formulate important economic yardsticks. And why should women work at very low salaries? They should not, and there should be specific strategies that should be devised from time to time to check such discrepancies. A lot needs to be done to end such discrepancies. For example, ending women's poverty, ending violence against women, and also achieve more sustainability both at the level of environment as well as at the level of resource generation. And all this can be achieved by empowering the girl child. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for your precious inputs to the topic as well as to the entire lecture. Dear friends, if you want to give your feedback or if you want to ask any question pertaining to the lecture, then do write to us at info.cec@nic.in. We would love to solve your queries. We would love to give answers to your questions when next time Dr. Shruti Webb visits our studio. Till then, dear friends, keep watching us. You can watch the lectures on YouTube, and yes, keep writing us. We would be meeting again soon. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you once again.
Thank you.